You described the context of American life and politics when Nixon took office in the beginning of 1969, and the influence that that sort of domestic context had on energy policy when that emerged as an issue very within a year or so of the administration. What was that original context like?
Well, I think there was a period of time when the American public was very much focused on these social issues, like the riots in the cities, the aftermath of the assassinations of Robert F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and then on top of that, we have this slowdown in our economy. So I think there was a real inward focus and uncertainty about where the country was headed. So I think that really was not directly related to energy, but it certainly shook the confidence of I think the American public and during the time that President Nixon took office.
And it created a partisan. Nixon was the first president since Zachary Taylor to have both houses of the Congress against him. And so that, when he needed support, both public support and congressional support for energy policies, that suddenly came into play, I think.
Yeah, I think that to then, be asked to pass legislation both on the environment and on energy that required a combination of sacrifices in some respects, in other ways changing of lifestyles in others, was, I think, in many ways a courageous thing. I know that there certainly was a political element to that, to be out front of issues as opposed to being pulled into them. So I'm not naive in thinking it was just altruism, but clearly I think it was a very smart move on the part of the president to take the initiative on that rather than wait till it came to him.
Looking back, I think a lot of people tend to think of the energy crisis as something that emerged I guess about 38 years ago, right this time, in October and November of '73 with the Yom Kippur War and the Arab oil embargo. But in fact, there was sort of a mini emergence or an initial emergence of energy as a problem that Nixon had to address in '71.
Exactly. There already were brownouts in electricity consumers in 1970, and his speech of June of '71 addressed those issues. There was a perception that natural gas was of limited supply, so there already were thoughts of limiting the uses of natural gas, and there was this slow growth, high inflationary economy. So the combination of all of those things, meant, that this crisis, if you want to call it that, energy problem was already emerging, with increasing demand and supply in the United States leveling off and about to decline.
How did you get into the energy game?
Well, I started studying it in graduate school and then was recruited to come to work at the Central Intelligence Agency and to work on Soviet oil in 1966. But after a very short time, switched over to international oil and was the Middle East oil analyst from about 1969 to 1974.
Again, I think conventional wisdom sees energy and the energy crisis as largely a function of domestic affairs and politics, but it really has energy has for Americans, has a major international aspect as well.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think what Secretary Kissinger was so upset about at the time of the Arab oil embargo, and even leading up to it, with getting threats from King Faisal of Saudi Arabia and from others in that region of the world, was that our dependence on their oil limited his freedom to make foreign policy moves, or at least it was perceived to be that way. So it had a very huge political, military, foreign policy component to it as well. It was even more than the direct economic effect of higher oil prices and shortages. It was this inability to actually make some of the foreign policy moves that our diplomats would need to make. And this was, I think, at the bottom of the bringing together all of these international foreign ministers here in Washington in February of 1974 by Secretary Kissinger.
What was that? That was the Washington Energy Conference, as you say, in February of '74. What was that?
The Washington Energy Conference was an attempt to provide a counterweight to the oil-producing countries and to set up a system where we did basically two objectives: coordinate energy policy among the major oil consumers and set up an energy emergency response system should there ever be another crisis like the Arab oil embargo. And what that included was a sharing scheme in which we would pool strategic petroleum reserves or inventories and tap them should any shortages inspired by political purposes ever happen again. And unfortunately, it took a long time to really get that established, so it was of no use at all during the 73, 74 time frame, and was barely up and running in 79 when the Shah of Iran fell. So the first time we really used it effectively was when Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990.
What role does the 15th of August '71 play in the context of American energy problems or history? The wage price controls.
Oh, I think it played an important role. I think.
Let me ask again.
Yeah.
What role do the wage price controls that were announced in the summer of 1971? What role does that play in the context of the American energy picture?
I think wage and price controls had a profound effect on both energy production and consumption in the United States during the period of the 70s. On the production side, by limiting the price for which producers and refiners could sell their oil, it reduced the incentive to invest. And what that led to was the peaking and declining of domestic oil production in the United States. So on the supply side, it limited investment. And on the consumption side, by setting a relatively low ceiling on price, consumers, as any smart consumer will do, when a good is relatively cheap, you buy more of it. So we had a double whammy. Domestic production was stagnating and eventually declining, and consumption was growing rapidly, 4 to 5% per year. And that led to higher and higher imports, so that when President Nixon came into office, we were importing maybe 25% of our oil. By the time the Arab oil embargo occurred 3 years later, it was approaching 35% of our oil. So it had a profound effect on both the supply and demand.
What role, if any, do you think that politics played in this story? In the first energy crisis in '71 was in the lead up to the '72 election, and the second one, the major one, in the summer and fall of '73, was when Watergate was heating up. Did politics play a part in this?
Oh, I think politics played an important role in energy. I mean, energy affects everyone's daily lives. So we're all consumers. So anything that affects our ability to use it more energy or less energy, price controls obviously was one of the. I think there's most politicians over the last 40 years, starting with Project Independence, have been unwilling to provide a message of talking to their constituents or consumers and saying, we need to pay the full price for a product such as energy, or we're going to have dislocations, and that's exactly what's happened. And for every president, from Richard Nixon on to Barack Obama, has come up with the same message, that we need to seek some form of independence or self-sufficiency. But the reality is that it's not economically or politically doable in the time frame that any politician has in mind.
How would you describe the Nixon legacy in energy?
I think, having now looked at in more detail once again at his various messages, his speeches, and the proposals, I think he deserves a lot of credit for being the first one to really make this issue a national issue. It was very much a regional issue up until that point. Texas, Louisiana, and Oklahoma, they were very happy when prices were high. And northeastern states were very unhappy when prices were high, and vice versa when prices were low. I think he raised it to the level that it was an issue that should be dealt with on a national level, and the proposal of a department under which all energy should be consolidated, which, although it didn't pass during his years, ultimately did, and the Department of Energy was formed. So I think that was his legacy, is making it a national issue, and well ahead of the time in which I think it would have happened if it was just allowed to only be a reaction to a crisis. I assume that if the Arab oil embargo had occurred and President Nixon had not decided to take this issue on early on, we would have just been that further behind in our ability to. There was a lot of issues to try to get the public support that was needed and to get the support from the energy industry. But having started it, we were that much farther ahead. Not that it's any easier even today.
Was there another problem too, with which probably still exists today? The more things change, the more they stay the same. With public opinion, that you mentioned, I thought that was a striking fact, that during the when the oil embargo was imposed, a lot of Americans didn't even know that we were importing oil. Is that what element did the not the ignorance, but the lack of public awareness play in the working out of the Nixon energy programs?
Well, public education with respect to energy was extremely minimal during the time when President Nixon took office. And there was the common perception that we produced all the oil we used. So it led to difficulty in not only getting the message across, but even during the response during an emergency, as the average public opinion at the time was this was a crisis created by the oil companies for their benefit. So then to ask the American public to drive 50 miles per hour to turn your thermostat down and the other things that were in his November 73 speech was a tough sell. And certainly the Democrats in Congress at that time were unwilling to give him any victory, given partly due to the weakness as a result of the Watergate scandal. So there was a combination of those things. So the American public has come a long way, but it's still there's still this I think perception that that we can turn things around much quicker than we can, which is this is a long-term issue.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.